legalizefreedom.com.
Good evening. I'm Greg Moffat of legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, and you can spell legalize with an S or a Z. Some people die, but everybody loses their lives. That's pretty much how I would characterize the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, whether you think that all or part of the government and non-governmental response has been justified or otherwise, this is what it has amounted to for hundreds of millions of people. They don't die, but they lose all or part of their lives. What I particularly want to discuss today is the concept of conditioning, which is controlling behavior, programming behavior, changing behavior, often by making associations deliberately or by design that were not there before. These associations being used to reinforce the new modes and codes of behavior. Now, in the title of this video, it mentions Pavlovs Dogs. You can look up that online if you're not sure who Pavlov was or what his experiments were about. But if you're not familiar with Pavlov himself, you've probably heard the term Pavlovian conditioning or Pavlovian response. And this is to do with a programmed response. And essentially what part of his experiments were working with dogs in a lab. And when the dogs were being fed, they came to associated feeding time with certain things happening. You know, it might have been the lab assistants coming in with the food. Anybody who's got a pet will recognize this. You know, you open the drawer to get the can opener out, or they hear the rattle of the box of, you know, kitty biscuits or whatever. You know, your pet reacts. They associate that with feeding time. It's something they look forward to, and it makes sense for them to think that because they learn this through experience. But what you can do is you can take some of those associations and use them to trigger the same response without the actual event. So you can trigger the anticipation of being fed without feeding. And this can be very useful when you're trying to control and regulate and manipulate behavior in animals or in people. For our own experience, I'll give you a couple of examples that should bring this home to pretty much everyone in quite a powerful way. We've probably got associations with past events, and certain things can trigger the memories of past events. These can be good and bad. Usually they're not indifferent. They tend to be pleasant or unpleasant. And I find that in smell and sound to be particularly powerful here. So for example, sound, you can hear a song maybe, and it brings back a period of time in your life or perhaps an event. It can be very sad, it can be very happy, and you can have a very powerful psychological and physiological response to that just by hearing that piece of music. For example, smell is another one. They can bring back an entire multi-sensory experience just by one smell. And again, that can be good or bad, tends not to be anything in between. When I was young, I remember my first ever girlfriend. The first time we ever went for a walk together, she was wearing a long red scarf. And after the walk, she gave it to me and said that I should have it. And I kept it for many years. And even after I no longer saw her, the smell on the scarf was her. It was a perfume, and it brought so many memories. It was such a powerful thing. And if any of this is resonating with you, then you understand what I'm talking about, how you can have a response to something that is not happening triggered by something associated with that. I talked to someone the other day who was training a guide dog for the blind, and she had a little buzzer that made a little sound as she walked around with this little Labrador puppy, and she had a series of dog treats which she would deploy at various points. The whole idea behind these little techniques was to get the dog to behave in a certain way, and it would get to a certain point where it no longer needed the dog treats or the buzzer. And that's just another different angle, different way of looking at this sort of conditioning. You see this happening to bring it to a human level, and also to make it relevant to our discussion about the pandemic response. You see this, for example, in the behaviour of prisoners, especially prisoners who have been incarcerated for a substantial period of time. They can often be released from prison and struggle in the outside world, the world that they once knew, because suddenly it's a very big place with a lot of possibilities and a lot of freedom that they become unaccustomed to. And in many cases, they crave control. They want the regimentation, they want the routine, they want to know what time things are happening, they want their restriction back. And you see this also in people who've been in the military, very regimented, literally, lives and routines. And they can struggle. They can struggle on the outside with all the decisions that have to be made and all the possibilities that there are and all the randomness. Other people, all the things that they're used to being tightly controlled are suddenly flung wide open. And all of this should be ringing bells now in terms of the last year and a half of pandemic restrictions, and how that has been, the lockdowns have been very much like, for many people, like being in prison. And no doubt, God knows the fear mongering and the propaganda that has come almost completely globally from the mainstream media in the last 18 months or so has been absolutely staggering in my lifetime, and I've never seen anything like it. I mean, it's the propaganda textbook on steroids. So it's no wonder that people have been responding like, trained dogs or, long-term prisoners, because this has been an all-out assault on the senses. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on about the psychological response and the physiological response, mind and matter are intimately connected. I could talk about this in the context of immune system, but the effect on our people's minds from being locked down, restricted, controlled, having so many things taken away, so many things prevented, so many new onerous things that they've had to comply with, affects the body as well. And most of this is not good. Not very many people can say that they've had lots of wonderful benefits from the pandemic restrictions. Some people have tried to talk some up. You certainly can look at positive dimensions of it, but those are usually mostly things that people take upon themselves very personally to do, and in ways of changing their lives and trying to focus on the positive. But for most people, it's been very negative, and that's therefore affected them physically in a negative way as well as psychologically. And a couple of other recent trends, particularly that have taken hold in the early 21st century that play into this. One is an overall decline in what I would generally call resilience, mostly psychological resilience in people. Their ability to withstand pressure from outside, cultural, social, all playing into the psychological. By that I mean, that everything's suddenly a problem, everybody's a problem, things that would have been coped with very well by people even half a generation ago, but certainly a generation ago, suddenly they're a great trial. And of course there are things in modern society that previous generations did not have to deal with, and the technological matrix that we find ourselves in, the 24/7 non-stop information war, brings its own challenges. But there are nevertheless a lot of behaviours now that those that went before us would have not understood, and wouldn't be able to comprehend how we can't cope with ostensibly quite straightforward things, how we seem unable to let brickbats and insults or whatever, or perceived insults, pass through us. So we demand constant control, protection. We demand that other people regulate still other people on our behalf so that we don't have to deal with any difficult ideas, any difficult opinions. So that certainly played into the last year and a half. And then there's been the obsession, particularly since 9/11, with safety and security, all of which I'd put under the umbrella of safetyism, which is this excessive belief in control and preventing potential danger, no matter how much that limits people's ability to choose for themselves, decide their own risks, just have general freedoms to do things, particularly if that is perceived. And it's bad enough if you're not able to make decisions about perceived risk to yourself and say, no, actually, this might be somewhat dangerous, but I want to do it. I want to live. It's even worse if it's seen to potentially affect someone else. And that's fine. I always say my general philosophy of life would be do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anyone else. But there's then the perception of what is that has the potential to hurt. And that has gotten somewhat out of whack, again, under this umbrella of safetyism. So these two, lack of resilience and obsession with safety and security, have really, really been amplified to a huge extent in general by the pandemic response. And we now have this new condition, which is obvious to anybody observing the fallout from the pandemic response, but it's now been given a name: COVID anxiety syndrome. And I was reading a news article the other day just here in the UK, and apparently a report, I'm not quite sure who's doing the report, it might actually be one of the government bodies responsible for coming up with a lot of the statistics on the pandemic itself. But in any event, they're going to be publishing a report on the rise of COVID anxiety syndrome, apparently affecting, depending on which metric, which dimension of this that they're polling people about. This is a response to public polls, apparently, anywhere between 40 and 60+% of the population being negatively affected by this. A couple of the most common dimensions of this syndrome involve public spaces and compulsive behaviour. And I'm sure you understand what I'm referring to here. There is this growing anxiety about returning to public spaces, particularly crowded public spaces, but just open spaces in general, no matter who's there or how many. And compulsive behaviour such as constant hand washing, constant cleaning of surfaces, fear of touching other things, and constantly thinking about others in terms of if they're demonstrating any symptoms, constantly checking things, what figures and facts and statistics about everything, rather than what is actually in front of your own eyes, what your experience is. When you do go out and you do interact with people, what does that feel like? What is actually happening? Instead, the response is being informed by, as I've been saying earlier, about this conditioning, about what you've gotten used to. So you already see a huge anxiety amongst people now about returning to all sorts of work and social situations. Here in the UK at the minute, we've seen significant easing of lockdown and other restrictions, social, cultural and business. I know this varies a great deal around the world. Some US states are very, very much open and free at the minute. Some are still very controlled and locked down. But this combination of anxiety about public spaces and about the compulsive behaviour, this is not something that's likely to just dissipate no matter what happens with the virus situation. The viral threat, whatever you perceive it to be and however significant you think it is, could vanish overnight And that would not by any means see a speedy end to this maladaptive behavior, this obsessive compulsive disorder behavior amongst so many people. And I predicted this, and it didn't take a genius to do this, early on. As soon as I saw the extent of the restrictions that were being brought in early in 2020, and the extreme fear mongering and people's reactions of absolute terror, I knew this was going to have tremendous fallout. And bear in mind that this was a process of thought that was going on when we expected maybe the whole thing would have been over in terms of restrictions this time last year. So God alone knows how much the problem has been added to by a further 12 months of restrictions and fear mongering and propaganda and reality being presented, on a screen rather than in lived experience. One of the most distressing aspects of this for me, speaking not as a parent, but you don't have to be a parent to be moved by this, is the effect that all of this has had on children and on their behaviour. Of course, many children, no matter what their age, whether they're 6 or whether they're 10 or whether they're 16, they're still being shaped, they're still becoming people, they're still forming a worldview, they're still finding their place in society and in culture. They're still learning, and they're still being informed by the world around them. And again, if you're 6 years old now and you've been living through there, even if you're 10, a year and a half is a hell of a lot more in terms of percentage in the life of a 10-year-old or a 6-year-old than it is someone at my age, and possibly yours as well. So to put it in perspective, can you imagine spending, relatively speaking, 5 years of your lifespan, or say 50% of your lifespan, 20, even 25, even 10% of your lifespan in lockdown? So think about that. If you're middle-aged now, think about what it'd be like if you'd spent 5 years in lockdown with extreme restrictions, inability to work or travel or do anything, and constant 24/7 fear. You're going to die. You're going to die. Imagine the psychological toll that would take. And I know, I've heard firsthand from people I personally know who've got children in their family, sometimes their own, sometimes those of siblings, whatever it happens to be. And I've heard some really, really upsetting and disturbing things about what has been happening to some children, mentally and physically as well. Some kids are more, able to deal with these sorts of things than others. But for every story I've heard of people making the best of it with homeschooling and little kids adapting really well, as they often do, to new circumstances, because they take the things as they come more than adults do, that they tend to be more flexible and resilient. There's 10 more stories of kids just really, really distressed, not able to understand why they can't see their friends and play with their friends, not understanding why they can't go out, not understanding why the adults are all covering their faces, and why, because fear is infectious. It really is. Again, pet owners will tell you this. Dogs and cats can sense the mood of their keepers, and it's the same with kids. And if I was a child psychologist, I'd probably be working on this all the time. Who knows what this is storing up for the future? What sort of adults are being made now in the midst of all this? I think probably all of this could be summed up. The most upsetting story I heard, I was here in the UK, there was a little girl who defecated herself in classroom because after, this was on her first day back, at school. And after the weeks and months of everything that she'd had to endure, the atmosphere in the school was so terrifying, and everything was so alien. You know, sit there, you know, follow these arrows, sit there. All the desks have been moved. If you go into the playground, go into that chalk circle, don't move until you're told to. Do this, do that. And it was all just too much for this child. And it, to end in that sort of humiliation. But that's that, and I'm sure that's not the only example of that. I'm sure there's worse. So we find ourselves as a species in a sort of psychological lockdown. I'd say for many people, not everyone, of course, far from it, but collectively there's a degree of psychological lockdown. And again, to bring this back to conditioning, what will change as things loosen up? Let's just say, for example, things continue to loosen a bit. We can talk about future scenarios some other time. There's going to be a lot of people who, no matter what external conditions are, in here, the pandemic goes on. They just can't break out of it for whatever reason. And it won't matter even if the numbers and statistics begin to reflect a different reality. As a species, we have a negativity bias. So bad news stories we'll latch on to and ruminate on, obsess over and act on, or not. Good news stories, which there are precious few of, they tend just not to get reported. They get glossed over and forgotten very quickly. It's the same with life experiences. You know, we all thinking on the past tend to bring up things that went wrong and things that were bad. And especially if we're going through a bad period, and we'll focus on those. And all the good memories tend to get sidelined, particularly if you're going through a bad time. It can be difficult to call upon good memories as a way to elevate your mood. Going forward, I just feel that a precedent has been set here, and it may be in future that our conditioned response will be such that we might not even need lockdown restrictions in order for people to behave as if there were some. If we're told that there are new variants or that cases are surging, whatever it happens to be, whatever the case is, however much of a risk that actually is, that some people will be very readily return to staying in, avoiding social contact, avoiding cultural events, just all the stuff that we've become used to. And we have become, it's another trend actually, I would say, again, particularly since 9/11. I know I often hark back to that, but I think it was along with the pandemic. I think going back, that was another point in time that I think we can see as changing things globally, after which things were never really quite the same again. So particularly after 9/11, we became more compliant, more ready in the airport, particularly to then stand here. Remember how many of those things in the airport we now see in the supermarket? Arrows, things to space you, people barking at you to step back, to move forward, to do this, to do that. And I think it will be much easier in future. And remember, this doesn't have to be another pandemic. It could be any other sort of declared emergency. However, whatever the nature of it is, for people then to be ready to stay at home, don't go to work, to stop doing all of the things that we took for granted for so long, and people will be very compliant with those restrictions. As I say, whether they're actually reflected or enacted in any legislation or guidance, or whether it's just kind of an inference. Again, you know, certain information is provided in the media, and people then, they have a lockdown, an instinctive programmed Pavlovian lockdown response. And I've seen this already over the last year, particularly now as restrictions start to ease. And by this, I'm talking about where I got the part of the title for this. 2 steps backward, 1 step forward. The opposite of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, which means you're generally making progress. 2 steps backward. We lose a lot of things as part of the lockdown pandemic response. We give up X, Y, and Z. At some point, restrictions ease and we get something back. one step forward. However, we're still not where we were before. We're still backward. One step forward. Then we take another 2 steps backward. Oh dear, give up some more stuff. But at some point, oh here, have something back. 1 step forward. We're even further back from where we started. And it's very easy for that, in that way, for us to begin to, and you can already see this happening, basically to be grateful for less. Like Pavlovs Dogs, we're just glad, or any other dog in training or any other prisoner being put into solitary, when they're back in the regular prison area, they're just grateful for that. Conditions are deplorable, but at least they're not in solitary. So we're given a little bit back. You can travel locally, whatever it happens to be. You can go back to work a few days. You can go to a bar, but there's a laundry list of things that you can't do at the bar that you used to be able to do. You can't play pool, you can't gamble on the machines, you can't approach the bar, you can't sit at the bar, you can't go to the bathroom, without asking permission. All of this stuff. But we're grateful for it. Oh, thank you. At least we're not being tortured anymore. We still got all the bruises from before, but we're not being beaten anymore. So I see that as a process of us becoming accustomed to living with less and being grateful for it. Speaking about supermarkets, as I was earlier, and not just supermarkets, of course, but all sorts of public places, including bars and restaurants, is all that infrastructure likely to be taken out? I'm thinking now of all the money that's been invested in plastic screens and all sorts of things that have changed the layout of public spaces, one-way systems, arrows on the floor. I mean, these are just some of the little simple things, but the supermarket that I frequent has completely changed their electronic checkout system and geared it towards the lockdown restrictions, the social restrictions that have been brought in. It's cost a lot of money. And this is just one supermarket they've got thousands. And there's now a very tightly controlled way of moving around, not the main supermarket itself, but in the checkout process. You can only go in one way, you can only get out one way. It didn't used to be like that. You can only move one way. There's lots of lights and things beeping and people standing around, staff members making sure that everybody stays in line. Oh, that's not all going to get taken out. That will remain there. And there's only one way to navigate those controlled spaces now, and that's in the same way. State of emergency or not, there's only one way. Like, have you ever seen a cattle market or a slaughterhouse, the way the animals move through in a very tightly controlled way? It's like that. There's only one way to do that. Whether you're going to slaughter the animals at the end of it or not, there's only one way for them to get through the maze. Simple as that. And I spoke last summer about the potential for the pandemic response to be used as part of what is commonly known as the Great Reset. This is the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, his program, not just his, of course, but the World Economic Forum in general. And this is something that's been in the works for a long time, and it's linked to United Nations agendas as well. And it's very openly talked about, and some would say perfectly legitimate ideas for reining in climate change and controlling consumption and moving towards green energy and keeping check on the population, all these sorts of things that a lot of people from different political backgrounds are concerned with, and different people have got different ideas about what to do about it, if anything. That's partly by the by. However, if the pandemic response has got any connection with any of these agendas, then thinking about that physical infrastructure I just mentioned, if we were allowed to go back completely to normal, to be happy shoppers and happy motorists, doing all those things that we were doing even a couple of years ago, all of this will have been for nothing. If there is no link between these things, then that may not matter, it may be by the by. But certainly the people, the World Economic Forum and other people, most of the representatives at the Davos meetings in January, a lot of these major global movers and shakers, political and from NGOs and other globalist organizations, they've got very clear things that they want to try and achieve. And I would have thought, if I was part of one of those groups, that it would be an absolutely wasted opportunity to allow the new normal to go back to the old normal. That's how I would see it. And so that's what I'm looking for in terms of future trends. So we'll see what happens. But I think that no matter what occurs, that we have had our buttons pushed and we've been programmed to think in certain ways and to respond in certain ways. And the behaviors that we've witnessed, those programmed responses, no matter what happens, are going to continue for some time to come. And I think it is going to be all too tempting for whoever it is in charge of whatever, even if it's just national politicians, it's going to be much too tempting for them not to exploit those, what they would see as weaknesses in future. I don't think they're going to be able to avoid doing that. But remember, thinking about obsession with safety and security and about what this life actually is, and remembering the fact that you and I are going to die, that we should ask ourselves in this context, what is life for? What do I want to do? Do I want to spend the rest of my life focusing only on being safe, whatever that looks like? Anybody who's ever done a bungee jump or gone snowboarding or done a parachute jump would probably say, no, I don't necessarily want safety to be the paramount thing in my life all the time. So closing thought, as Orwell said in 1984, the object is not to stay alive. The object is to stay human. I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.
LegalizeFreedom.com